Tough question. Are you among the many professing Christians who are sinning against Christ in evangelism? If so, please keep listening. Because one reason God gives equipping evangelists to local churches is to lead Christians from sin to obedience. That's why in this episode of the podcast, I'll again open Ephesians chapter 4 to equip the saints and to continue our pre-conference mini-series that every evangelistic church simply must hear. This is the Equipping Evangelist, a podcast that equips your entire church for evangelism together. My name's Cory McKenna. And after years as a pastor and evangelist in the local church, I founded an equipping ministry called The Cross Current, and now this podcast, all to share my experience and expertise with you. Equipping Evangelists is our ministry, equipping evangelists in their own churches to equip their own saints for the work of gospel ministry together. And the Equipping Evangelist Conference really facilitates an exclusive in-person opportunity for church leaders and their equipping evangelist candidates to both explore and experience the impact of equipping evangelism together. Now, because the role and really the responsibilities of equipping evangelists are very, very new to many, if not most, church leaders, I'm hosting this pre-conference mini-series that every evangelistic church simply must hear. And in the last episode, I started a deep dive into Ephesians chapter 4, and I taught through the first and foremost role of an equipping evangelist, which is this: maintaining unity. That's really kind of the big idea of Ephesians chapter 4, maintaining unity. Now here's the second role: equipping the saints. Equipping the saints. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12a, Paul teaches, and he, Jesus, gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds and teachers. Why? To equip the saints for the work of ministry. Now, check this out. The word equipping Paul uses here is a very interesting word. It refers to restoring something to its original condition, or being made fit or complete. And in this context, equipping refers to, hear this, equipping refers to leading Christians from sin to obedience. This is pretty heavy, okay? I mean, Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey me. So to not obey Christ is called what? It's called sin. So is loving one another a command of Christ? Yes. For every Christian? Yes. So to not do so is called what? It's called sin. Is making disciples a command of Christ? Yes. For every individual Christian? Yes. So to not do so is called sin. Is preaching the gospel a command of Christ? Yes. For every individual Christian? Yes. So to not do so is called sin. And so our ministry and this podcast, they're pretty important, because our God-given goal of equipping evangelists, and as equipping evangelists, is to multiply in others the ministry of evangelism from sin to obedience. Okay? To multiply in others the ministry of evangelism from sin to obedience. But further connected, this is so cool, further connected to this idea of biblical equipping are spiritual gifts. And this is huge. We know that all Christians have spiritual gifts, and God himself gives us these spiritual gifts to be used in sharing Christ and ministering to one another. We can read about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, in 1 Peter chapter 4, in Romans chapter 12, and so on and so on. And this is why the Cross Current and Equipping Evangelists, we teach church on mission as really a three-strand principle that we call His gospel, His gifts, His glory. Did you catch that? His gospel, His gifts, His glory. Because in the big picture, our goal as a servant ministry to the local church and the goal of the equipping evangelist in the local church is to equip entire churches to share His gospel, right? To share His gospel in accordance with His gifts together for His glory. In fact, because we believe that practicing these gifts is so vital to the gospel witness and gospel mission of local churches in their communities, the Cross Current even offers spiritual gift seminars to equip every saint to both discover and demonstrate their God-given spiritual gifts together. And again, practically, in the big picture, because preaching the gospel and making disciples is the Great Commission. I could either share, the gospel alone on any given day, maybe so, a dozen gospel seeds for Christ, or I could equip a dozen or even more saints to share the gospel and sow hundreds or even thousands of gospel seed for Christ. Because churches that unify in the gospel multiply in the gospel. And to draw out this truth we have gospel leadership seminars, very, very helpful for pastors and elders in local churches. I like to ask leaders in those seminars, how many seeds are in an apple? I'm not a farmer, but if you crack open an apple and you count them up, about 7. There's about 7 seeds in the average apple. Well, how many apples are in a seed? Think about that. Entire orchards full. Well, likewise, as equipping evangelists, disciple makers in evangelism, we don't just add seed sowers, though that's a good thing. We actually multiply. God multiplies entire orchards of gospel seed through the equipping of the saints, and that is a great thing. So that's why if you desire to see your church both unify and multiply in the gospel, and I hope you do, you will not want to miss the rest of this pre-conference mini-series. I think there's only one episode left, because on the next episode, I'll biblically define the third responsibility of an equipping evangelist according to Ephesians chapter 4 toward unifying and multiplying your church in the gospel. Okay, but until then, do you have any questions that I could help answer about evangelism and your church? To submit those, just go to theequippingevangelist.com, click on the Got Questions, Get Answers button, submit those directly to me. And will you also please subscribe to and share this podcast with others? Just click that subscribe button below to listen every week and to get your entire church equipped for evangelism together. And then share this podcast. Multiply gospel ministry in and through the local church by sharing this podcast with all of your Christian contacts. And may God bless you and your church as you get equipped for evangelism together.